The alarm did not sound like an alarm. It sounded like a scream trapped inside a machine, and I heard it before I even reached my station. My name is Vexthala Orn, and on that day I was already tired, already behind on 3 other reports, when the duty officer grabbed my arm and told me a single unregistered vessel had crossed into the threshold colonies, without permission, without a signal, without so much as a polite request to pass through council space. I remember laughing, not because it was funny, but because it was familiar. Every few cycles, some young species wandered too far from its home system, got lost, got greedy, or got brave, and every time the outcome was the same. I sat down at my console, pulled up the sensor feed, and typed in the request for identification before I had even finished sitting. The answer came back in less than a second. Human. I want to explain what that word meant to us at the time, because it will matter later. Humanity was young. Humanity was loud. Humanity had been flying between stars for what we considered the blink of an eye, and in that blink, they had already fought 3 wars among themselves that we knew of, and possibly more that we did not. They built ships that were, by every measure my instruments could take, unremarkable. Their metals were common. Their engines were common. Their weapons, when we bothered to catalog them, were common. The only uncommon thing about humans was how often they did things that made no sense to anyone watching from outside. The vessel on my screen was small, a single ship, not a fleet, not even a proper warship by the classification standards we used, moving through contested space, near the mining routes of the threshold colonies, as though it owned the stars around it. I ran the identification protocol twice, because the first result seemed like an error. 1 ship, no escort, no visible weapons charge. It was simply flying, unhurried, toward a region patrolled by 4 council battle groups. I typed up the incident report the way I had typed up 100 incident reports before it. Unauthorized entry, single vessel, human registry, estimated threat level minimal. I remember the exact words I chose, because I have read them back to myself more times than I care to admit since that day. I wrote that any engagement, should the council choose to pursue one, would conclude within 6 standard hours, with total human defeat as the only realistic outcome. I submitted the report and went to get something to eat, because that is what you do when a problem appears small enough to ignore. The canteen on the analysis deck was mostly empty at that hour, just a scattering of clerks and translators picking at their meals, and I remember sitting near the window that looked out over the docking rings, watching the lights of a dozen council cruisers blink in slow, patient rhythms. I was thinking about nothing more important than whether I had time to finish my meal before my next assignment, when my communicator chimed with a priority summons. Priority summons meant someone above me had read my report and did not like something about it. I assumed I had made a formatting error, or perhaps used the wrong classification code for the vessel's origin system. I gathered my things, apologized to no one in particular for leaving my meal unfinished, and made my way toward the war room, a place I had visited perhaps twice before in my entire career, both times as a silent observer standing near the back wall. This time I was not standing near the back wall. This time, a broad-shouldered officer of the Threk military caste met me at the door and told me, with an expression I mistook for irritation, but now recognize as barely restrained amusement, that I had been requested by name as the analyst of record for the human incident. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because honesty is the only thing I have left that matters. I felt proud. I felt, for the first time in a long career of writing reports that vanished into archives no one read, that my work had been noticed. I did not feel afraid. I did not feel uncertain. I felt like a small, insignificant piece of the council machine had finally been given a seat at the table, and I walked into that war room with my head high, and my report clutched against my chest like it was something valuable. The room itself was larger than I expected, a wide amphitheater of consoles and viewing screens arranged around a central holographic display that currently showed the threshold colonies rendered in soft blue light, with the human vessel marked as a single amber point, drifting toward the edge of council territory. Officers and diplomats from a dozen species filled the seats, some in military uniform, others in the ceremonial robes of the diplomatic corps, all of them watching the amber point with the kind of relaxed interest usually reserved for a mildly entertaining broadcast. An admiral of the Korvathi fleet, a species built low and wide with skin like polished stone, waved me toward an empty seat near the front. I did not know his name then. I would learn it soon enough, and I would remember it for the rest of my life, though not for reasons that would please him. He asked me, in the blunt manner Korvathi officers were known for, whether my assessment still stood. 6 hours. Total defeat. I told him it did. I told him, in fact, that I considered 6 hours to be a generous estimate, and that the actual engagement, should the human vessel be foolish enough to resist rather than surrender, would likely conclude much sooner than that, simply because our forces would overwhelm it so completely that further resistance would become physically impossible. Several of the officers around me laughed at this, not cruelly, but the way you laugh when someone confirms something you already believed. A diplomat from one of the smaller advisory delegations, a slender being with large dark eyes and a nervous habit of touching the console in front of her, asked whether the human ship had made any attempt at communication. The answer, relayed by the tactical officer monitoring the feed, was that it had not. No hailing signal, no request for passage, no acknowledgement of the 4 council battle groups now moving to intercept it. I found this troubling in a small way, though I did not say so aloud. In my experience, even the most reckless species usually sent some kind of signal when facing overwhelming force, if only to buy time or attempt negotiation. Silence was unusual, but unusual was not the same as dangerous, and I told myself that humans were simply too young and too proud to understand the situation they had wandered into. The Admiral gave the order to intercept. I watched the amber point on the display continue its slow, steady path, apparently unaware or uncaring that 4 battle groups, each one containing more firepower than most systems could produce in a generation, were converging on its position from 4 different directions. Someone brought refreshments. I remember this clearly, because it struck me even then as strange, the casualness of it. Officers passing drinks and light snacks around the room, as though we were settling in to watch a sporting event, rather than what was, technically, the opening moves of an armed engagement. Bets were placed, quietly, between a pair of junior officers seated behind me, on how many minutes it would take the human ship to attempt a retreat once the battle groups came into weapons range. Nobody bet that it would not retreat at all. Nobody considered that a serious possibility. I was asked, again, to confirm my assessment for the official record, and I did, my voice steady, my confidence unshaken. I remember feeling, in that moment, a kind of quiet satisfaction. I had done my job well. I had read the data correctly. I had told my superiors exactly what they wanted to hear, and exactly what I believed to be true, and soon the display in front of us would confirm it, and my name would be attached to a correct prediction in the official archive, and perhaps that would be the end of it, a small footnote in a career otherwise made of forgotten paperwork. The tactical officer announced that the lead battle group had achieved weapons lock. The room went quiet, in the particular way that rooms go quiet just before something satisfying is about to happen. I leaned forward in my seat, the way everyone else did, watching the amber point on the display, waiting for the moment it would either turn to flee or be swallowed by the converging blue markers of our fleet. The amber point did not move. I remember the Admiral leaning toward the tactical officer and asking, in a low voice that still somehow carried across the room, whether the human vessel's engines had failed. The tactical officer checked, and checked again, and reported that the engines were fully operational, that the ship was simply holding its position, drifting at a steady, unhurried velocity, directly toward the heart of our formation, as though the 4 battle groups surrounding it were nothing more than scenery. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room, the kind of laughter that comes from nervousness pretending to be confidence. Someone near the back suggested that the human crew had perhaps miscalculated their own instruments, or did not understand what they were looking at. Someone else suggested that this was simply human arrogance, a species too proud and too young to recognize the size of the force arrayed against it. I said nothing. I was watching the amber point, and something about its stillness had begun to bother me, in a way I could not yet explain. It was not the stillness of confusion. It was not the stillness of fear. It was, if I am honest about what I felt watching it, the stillness of patience. And patience was not a quality I had expected to find in a species we had spent so long describing as reckless. The Admiral gave the order to open fire. I watched the first volley leave the lead battle group, a coordinated pattern of energy weapons designed by Doctrine to overwhelm a single target from multiple angles simultaneously. a formation so standard that every cadet in council military academies learned it in their first cycle of training. I had seen simulations of this formation 100 times. I had never seen it fail. The volley reached the amber point, and for one instant, the display flared with the telltale bloom of impact, a burst of light that every officer in that room recognized immediately as a direct hit. The room erupted into applause. I remember it clearly, the sound of hands and claws and whatever other appendages a dozen species use to express approval, all of it rising together in a single wave of premature celebration. The Admiral turned to me with something like a smile and told me that my 6-hour estimate had apparently been far too generous. I did not smile back. I was still watching the display, and something in the data scrolling across my console had caught my attention in a way that made the sound of the room fade into the background. The impact had registered. The energy signature had been recorded. But the amber point had not disappeared, had not fragmented, had not shown any of the debris scatter that a destroyed or even critically damaged vessel should have produced. It had simply kept moving. I raised my hand, an old academic habit I had never fully unlearned, and asked the tactical officer to confirm the status of the target vessel. There was a pause, longer than it should have been, before the answer came back, and when it did, the room's celebratory noise died all at once, replaced by a silence that felt very different from the eager silence of a few minutes before. The human vessel showed no measurable damage. I looked at the numbers on my own console, ran the calculation myself because some part of me refused to believe what I had just heard, and found the same impossible result waiting for me there. A direct hit, confirmed by 3 independent tracking systems, delivered by a weapons array capable of cracking open the hull of a ship twice the human vessel's size, and the target had simply absorbed it, or deflected it, or done something to it that our instruments could not adequately describe, and continued on its course, as though nothing at all had happened. The Admiral's smile was gone. He asked, quietly this time, for a second volley, and I watched the display with a tightness in my chest that I did not yet have a name for, because some distant, quiet part of my mind had already begun to suspect that the 6 hours I had promised the council, the confident number I had written down so carelessly at the start of my shift, might turn out to be very, very wrong. The second volley fired. I watched the amber point on the display, and I found myself, for the first time since I had entered that room, genuinely uncertain of what I was about to see. The second volley struck the amber point exactly as the first had, 4 separate beams converging from 4 separate angles at the exact moment doctrine demanded, a pattern designed so that no single point of a hull could escape the combined force of the strike. I watched the display flare again with that same bright, confident bloom of impact, and for a heartbeat I allowed myself to hope that this time the numbers would be different, that this time the ship would break apart the way every reasonable calculation said it should. The bloom faded. The amber point kept moving. Somewhere behind me, a diplomat whispered a question to a colleague, too quiet for me to hear the words, but not too quiet for me to hear the fear underneath them. The Admiral did not ask for a third volley immediately. He stood very still, his stone-colored hands resting on the edge of the tactical console, staring at the display as though it had personally insulted him. I want to describe what happened next as calmly as I can, because at the time, nothing about it felt calm at all. The lead battle group, 12 vessels strong, shifted formation on the Admiral's order, moving to encircle the human ship from every remaining angle, a maneuver meant to guarantee that no evasive action could save it from the next exchange. It was, by every measure I had studied in my years analyzing Council military doctrine, an overwhelming and inescapable position. I remember thinking, even as my earlier confidence had already begun to crack, that surely no single vessel, however strange its defenses, could withstand being surrounded on all sides by 12 warships at once. The human ship did not wait for the encirclement to finish. It moved. I have tried many times since that day to describe the way it moved, and I have never found language adequate to the task. It was not fast in the way we understood fast, a smooth acceleration along a plotted course. It was closer to instantaneous, a shift from one position to another that our sensors struggled to record as continuous motion at all, as though the ship had simply stopped existing in one place and begun existing in another. The tactical officer's console flooded with error messages, sensor drift warnings, contact loss alerts, and for nearly 2 full seconds nobody in that room, myself included, had any idea where the human vessel actually was. Then the nearest ship in the lead battle group, a cruiser I remember only by its designation number because I never learned its captain's name, lost power across its entire forward section in a single instant. Not destroyed, not exploded. Simply and completely disabled, its weapons dark, its shields collapsed, its engines drifting to a stop. All of it happening so quickly that the cruiser's own crew did not appear to have fired a single shot in response. The room around me had gone entirely silent now, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe properly. I looked at the Admiral. His expression had not changed to fear, not yet, but something in his posture had shifted, a stiffness that had not been there before. The stance of a soldier who has just realized the ground beneath him is not as solid as he believed. He gave the order for the remaining 11 ships to converge fire on the human vessel's last known position, and I watched the tactical display fill with a storm of weapons fire, more concentrated firepower than I had ever seen deployed against a single target in my entire career studying Council military history. For a moment, the amber point vanished entirely inside the visual representation of that storm, swallowed by so much overlapping energy that the display itself struggled to render it clearly. When the storm cleared, the amber point was still there, and 2 more of our ships had gone dark. I do not know how to properly explain what I felt in that moment, watching numbers that should not have been possible appear on my own console, numbers I had personally helped generate the models that predicted would never occur. My entire professional identity had been built on the belief that the Council's military doctrine was, if not perfect, then at least fundamentally sound, tested across centuries of engagements against dozens of species, refined and reinforced, until it had become something close to scientific law. I had built my 6-hour prediction on that foundation. I had stood in front of the most senior officers in this sector of Council space and told them, with complete confidence, that the law would hold. It was not holding. The Admiral called for a status report from the second battle group, positioned several minutes away and still approaching, and I remember the strange, brittle hope in his voice as he asked whether they were close enough to assist. They were not. They would not arrive for several more minutes, and in the silence that followed that answer, I understood, perhaps before anyone else in that room fully allowed themselves to understand it, that whatever was happening to the lead battle group was going to finish happening long before any help could arrive. The nervous diplomat who had asked earlier about communication attempts spoke again, her voice thin and unsteady, asking whether we had tried to contact the human vessel since the engagement began. Nobody had. In the chaos of the opening exchange, in the confident assumption that this would be over quickly and decisively in our favor, no one had thought it necessary to speak to the thing we were trying to destroy. The Admiral ordered a channel opened. I watched the communications officer's hands move across her console, watched the request ping outward toward the amber point that had, in the space of perhaps 4 minutes, disabled 3 of our warships without appearing to sustain any damage in return. There was no response. The channel remained open, silent, waiting, while on the tactical display the human vessel continued its unhurried path, deeper into the heart of our formation, moving with the same eerie patience it had shown from the very beginning, as though it had never once considered the possibility that it might lose. I looked down at the report still clutched in my hands, the one I had written so carelessly only a few hours before, the one that predicted total human defeat within 6 standard hours, and I felt something cold settle into my chest, that I would later come to recognize as the first true fear of my life. Not fear of the human ship itself, not yet, not fully. Fear of how wrong I had been, fear of how confidently I had been wrong, fear of every other report sitting in the Council archive, written by analysts just like me, describing humanity as young, as reckless, as fundamentally measurably weaker than the civilizations that had come before them. The Admiral turned to me and asked, in a voice that had lost all of its earlier confidence, whether my assessment still stood. I did not answer right away. I was watching the display, watching the amber point move closer to the center of our remaining formation, and some part of me, some analytical instinct I had spent my entire career developing, was already beginning to understand that we were no longer watching a battle whose outcome was uncertain. We were watching something else entirely, something I did not yet have the language to describe, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that frightened me more than anything the human ship had done so far, that whatever this was, it was only getting started. I did not answer the Admiral's question, and in the silence that followed, the tactical officer's console produced a new alert, one that pulled every eye in the room back to the display before I could find any words at all. The human vessel had stopped moving. For a moment I allowed myself a small, foolish hope that this meant something had finally gone wrong for them, that whatever strange capability had let them shrug off 2 full volleys and disable 3 of our warships had reached some limit at last. I watched the remaining ships of the lead battle group hold their positions around the amber point, weapons still charged, waiting for an order that the Admiral seemed reluctant to give. Then the amber point began to pulse, a slow, steady rhythm on the display that the tactical officer identified, after a tense few seconds of analysis, as an outgoing transmission. Not a weapons signature, not a defensive maneuver. A message, broadcast on an open frequency, addressed to every remaining vessel in the lead battle group at once. The Admiral ordered it played for the room. I remember the voice clearly, even now, because it was so different from what I expected. It was calm. It was quiet, almost gentle. A woman's voice speaking our own trade language with an accent that marked her clearly as human, though her words were precise enough that I understood every one of them without needing translation. She identified herself only as the commanding officer of the vessel, gave no name, offered no explanation for the ship's presence in our space, and made a single request. She asked that the remaining ships withdraw. I heard someone in the room laugh, a short, disbelieving sound quickly swallowed by the tension around it. The Admiral did not laugh. He stood very still, listening to the recording play a second time, his stone-colored features unreadable, in a way I had never seen from him before. When the message ended, he turned to the tactical officer and asked, in a voice stripped of all its earlier command, what our remaining forces' status actually was. The numbers that came back were not good. 3 ships fully disabled, drifting without power. The remaining 9 vessels of the lead battle group intact but scattered, their formation broken by the human ship's earlier movement. Their weapons crews rattled by, watching 2 full volleys accomplish nothing at all. I watched the Admiral weigh the request in front of him, watched the muscles along his jaw tighten as he considered what it would mean, professionally and personally, to withdraw from an engagement against a single enemy vessel. He refused. I do not think, even now, that I can fully blame him for that decision. He was a career officer in a fleet that had never lost a major engagement against a species we classified as lesser, and the idea of retreating from one ship, however strange its capabilities, must have felt like a wound to something deeper than strategy. He ordered the remaining 9 vessels to reform and engage as one coordinated unit, concentrating every available weapon on a single sustained strike, rather than the rolling volleys we had tried before. The order was given. I watched the 9 ships align themselves with an efficiency that, even now, in the middle of everything falling apart around us, struck me as almost beautiful, a display of coordinated firepower, built from centuries of refined doctrine. If anything in the galaxy could break through whatever defense the human vessel possessed, I remember thinking, it would be this. The strike was delivered. I watched the display fill with light again, brighter and more sustained than either of the previous volleys. A continuous stream of concentrated energy poured directly into the amber point's position for nearly 10 full seconds, an eternity in the language of modern space combat. When the light faded, the human vessel remained exactly where it had been, apparently untouched, and 4 more of our ships had gone dark. The room did not erupt into panic, not exactly, but something close to it rippled through the seats around me, officers leaning toward each other in low, urgent voices, diplomats gripping the edges of their consoles as though the floor itself had become uncertain beneath them. I looked at the tactical display and understood, with a kind of numb clarity, that we had just watched 13 of our best warships attempt to destroy a single enemy vessel, using every tool available to modern Council military doctrine, and that vessel had not sustained a single confirmed point of damage in return. The Admiral called for the second battle group's status again. They were closer now, only minutes away, and I watched him grip the edge of the console, as though counting down those minutes in his own mind, weighing whether reinforcement would arrive in time to change what was clearly becoming an unwinnable engagement. It was in that pause, in that brief window of desperate recalculation, that the human vessel moved again. This time I watched it happen more carefully, forcing myself to focus on the raw sensor data rather than the smoothed, simplified version the main display presented. And what I saw disturbed me even more than the earlier displays of impossible speed. The ship was not simply fast. Its movements followed no pattern our combat prediction algorithms could model, no consistent acceleration curve, no repeating maneuver signature that a trained tactical officer could learn to anticipate. It moved the way water moves around an obstacle, finding the exact gaps in our formation, without hesitation, without wasted motion, as though the entire battle had already been calculated and resolved somewhere in that ship's systems, long before the first shot was ever fired. 2 more of our vessels went dark in the space of perhaps 3 seconds. I watched their crew's emergency beacons activate on a secondary display, small red markers indicating life support failures and requests for immediate evacuation, and I understood, with a lurch of something that was not quite fear and not quite grief but sat somewhere close to both, that real people were suffering inside those hulls, not abstract numbers on a report, but soldiers who had trusted the same doctrine I had, the same confident predictions I had helped write. The Admiral finally gave the order to withdraw. It came too late to matter for the 6 ships already disabled, but the remaining vessels of the lead battle group began pulling back from the human ship's position, their formation broken entirely now, their retreat lacking any of the discipline that had characterized their advance less than 15 minutes earlier. I watched the amber point on the display hold its position rather than pursue them, and something about that restraint bothered me even more than the earlier violence had, though I could not yet explain why. The room around me had gone quiet in a new way, a stunned, exhausted quiet that felt very different from the eager silence at the start of the engagement. The Admiral stood with his back to the room, staring at the display, and I do not think anyone dared speak to him in that moment, myself included. I sat in my chair with my useless report still in my hands, watching the numbers scroll across my console, and I understood that whatever I thought I knew about humanity, whatever the entire council believed about this young, loud, supposedly manageable species, had just been proven catastrophically wrong in front of every senior officer in this sector. The second battle group arrived 4 minutes later, too late to have changed anything, and I watched their commander request instructions from the Admiral, in a voice that already carried the uncertain edge of someone who had heard enough of the earlier exchange to know that easy answers were no longer available. I remember looking at the clock display in the corner of my console, doing the calculation almost without meaning to, and realizing that from the moment the first volley had been fired to the moment our forces began their retreat, less than 20 minutes had passed. 20 minutes. Not 6 hours. Not even a fraction of 6 hours. I sat very still in my chair, and for the first time since I had entered that room, with my head held high, and my report clutched against my chest like something valuable, I understood that I had been looking at this entire situation the wrong way from the very beginning. The second battle group did not engage immediately, and for that small mercy I found myself grateful in a way that surprised me, because some part of me had already begun to suspect that engaging further would accomplish nothing except adding more names to the list of crews requesting emergency evacuation. The Admiral ordered the newly arrived commander to hold position at a distance, to observe rather than advance, and I remember thinking that this was the first genuinely wise decision anyone had made since the engagement began, though it had come only after 6 ships had already been lost to a single enemy vessel. I was asked, again, to provide an updated assessment. I remember standing up from my seat on unsteady legs, walking to the front of the room where a secondary console had been prepared for exactly this purpose, and staring at the data in front of me for a long moment before I could make myself speak. Every model I had trained on, every historical engagement I had studied, every piece of doctrine the Council had refined across centuries of contact with dozens of other species, none of it accounted for what I had just watched happen. I told the room, as honestly as I could manage, that I did not currently have an explanation for the human vessel's capabilities, and that any further prediction I offered would be built on guesswork rather than sound analysis. This did not go over well. A representative from the diplomatic corps, an older being with pale, translucent skin and an expression of barely restrained frustration, asked me directly how a single unarmed-looking vessel could disable 6 warships without sustaining measurable damage. I told her, honestly, that unarmed-looking did not mean unarmed. and that whatever weapons or defensive systems the ship possessed were clearly operating on principles our sensors were not equipped to properly interpret. She asked whether this meant humanity possessed technology beyond the Council's own. I remember hesitating before answering, because the question touched on something I had not yet allowed myself to fully consider. Humanity, by every account in our records, had been spacefaring for a comparatively short span of time. Their industrial capacity, their fleet numbers, their overall technological development had always been rated well below Council standards in every prior assessment I had reviewed. And yet the ship in front of us had just done something that should have been, by every reasonable measure, impossible. I told her that I did not believe this was simply a matter of superior technology, though I could not yet explain what I meant by that, only that something about the engagement felt different from a straightforward difference in weapons capability. It felt, though I struggled to find the right words for it in front of that room, like watching a species that had approached an unequal fight with a level of preparation and restraint that suggested they had expected exactly this outcome from the very beginning. The Admiral asked what evidence I had for that claim. I did not have evidence, not yet, only instinct, and I told him so plainly, which earned me a look of frustration I did not entirely blame him for. But even as I said it, the tactical officer's console produced new data, sensor readings pulled from the wreckage of one of our disabled ships, and what they showed changed the tone of the room once again. The disabled cruiser had not been destroyed by conventional weapons fire. Its systems had been shut down through some kind of targeted interference, a precise disruption of its power core and weapons array that left the hull, the crew compartments, and the life support systems entirely intact. I watched the tactical officer read this finding aloud to the room, watched confusion ripple across the faces around me as everyone tried to understand what it meant. It meant, as far as I could determine, that the human vessel had possessed the capability to destroy our ships outright, and had chosen not to. I remember the silence that followed that realization more vividly than almost anything else from that day. It was not the silence of relief, though perhaps it should have been. It was the silence of a room slowly understanding that the species it had spent so long underestimating had just demonstrated, through 6 disabled ships and 0 fatalities, a level of control and precision that no amount of raw firepower could have shown. A weaker fleet does not choose restraint. A weaker fleet fights for survival with everything it has. What we had witnessed was not a struggling underdog fighting for its life. It was something closer to a demonstration, delivered with a kind of calm efficiency that I found, the more I considered it, more unsettling than outright violence would have been. The Admiral called for a full data review, pulling in every sensor log, every communication intercept, every fragment of information we had gathered since the human vessel first entered our territory. I was assigned to the review team, still shaking slightly from adrenaline I did not fully understand, and for the next several hours I sat with a team of analysts, poring over data that told a story none of us had been prepared to read. We found records, buried in older intelligence files that had never been prioritized for full analysis, describing brief and largely dismissed encounters between human vessels and minor Council client states along the outer trade routes. In every case, the reports had been filed as minor incidents, border disputes resolved quickly and without significant escalation, and in every case, upon closer review now, the human side had ended the encounter swiftly, decisively, and with almost no loss of life on either side. We had simply never thought to compare these incidents against each other before, because no one had ever considered humanity important enough to warrant that level of scrutiny. I found myself thinking, as I worked through that data late into what passed for night on the station, about how much of Council military doctrine had been built on the assumption that observable weakness meant actual weakness. Humanity's fleet numbers were smaller than ours. Their industrial output was smaller than ours. Their territory was a fraction of the size of the client states we had spent centuries cataloging and, when necessary, correcting through direct intervention. Every visible metric suggested a young, vulnerable species, and I had trusted those metrics completely, because they were the metrics I had been trained to trust. But metrics only measure what you think to measure, and somewhere in the gap between what we had counted and what actually mattered, humanity had built something we had no framework for understanding at all. The Admiral called another meeting late that evening, this one smaller, more urgent, restricted to senior officers and the analysts who had been directly involved in the engagement. I was asked to present my findings, and I remember standing in front of that smaller, quieter room, feeling the weight of every eye on me, understanding that whatever I said next would shape how the council responded to a threat none of us fully understood yet. I told them, as carefully and honestly as I could, that I believed we had made a critical error in how we assessed humanity from the very beginning. I told them that raw numbers, whether of ships or weapons or territory, had never been the right measure for a species whose actual strength lay somewhere else entirely, somewhere I still did not have adequate language to describe. I told them that the 6-hour prediction I had submitted at the start of the day had been wrong, not because I had made a calculation error, but because I had been using the wrong equation from the very start. The Admiral asked what equation I would use instead. I did not have a good answer for him that night. I only knew, with a certainty that had settled into me somewhere during those long hours of data review, that the old equation, the one the entire council had relied on for generations to measure the danger of a new species, no longer applied, and that we were going to need an entirely new way of thinking before we faced anything like this again. News of the engagement spread through the council station faster than any official channel could control, and by the following morning, I found myself fielding questions from analysts and officers I had never met before, all of them wanting to know how a single human vessel had disabled 6 warships in less time than it took most engagements just to begin. I had no simple answer for them, and I had stopped pretending that I did. The Admiral called me back to his office that morning, and I remember walking through corridors that felt different somehow, quieter, the usual confident bustle of the station, replaced by something more subdued. He was standing at the window when I arrived, looking out over the docking rings where repair crews were already working on the 6 disabled cruisers, their crews shaken, but alive, and he asked me, without turning around, whether I thought the human vessel would return. I told him I did not know, and that uncertainty itself felt like a small victory of honesty, after a day spent making confident predictions that had turned out to be wrong. He asked whether I thought the engagement represented an isolated incident or a preview of something larger, and I told him what I had come to believe overnight, sitting alone with the data long after the review team had gone to rest. I told him that I believed humanity had not stumbled into our territory by accident. The precision of the engagement, the restraint shown in disabling rather than destroying our ships, the brief and carefully worded message requesting withdrawal rather than issuing threats, none of it matched the profile of a reckless young species blundering into a fight beyond its understanding. It matched, instead, the profile of a species that had known exactly what it was doing from the moment it crossed into council space, one that had perhaps even anticipated exactly the kind of overwhelming response we would send against it, and had prepared for that response with a level of calm confidence I found difficult to reconcile with everything the council had believed about them. The Admiral asked what that meant for the council's broader assessment of humanity. I told him, carefully, that I believed we needed to consider the possibility that we had been measuring the wrong things for a very long time. We had counted ships and weapons and territory, and by those measures, humanity had always looked small and manageable. But somewhere beneath those numbers, humanity had developed capabilities we did not understand, guided by a strategic patience that suggested a level of maturity we had never credited them with, and I believed that underestimating them further would only lead to worse outcomes than the one we had just experienced. He was quiet for a long moment after that, still looking out at the repair crews below, and when he finally spoke again, his voice carried none of the confident authority I had heard from him in the war room the day before. He asked me, almost gently, what I thought the council should do next. I did not have a complete answer for him, but I told him what I believed to be true, which was that the council's first mistake had already been made, and that our next mistake, if we were not careful, would be trying to solve this new problem using the same old tools that had failed us so completely. I told him that whatever came next needed to begin not with more firepower, but with genuine understanding, an honest attempt to learn what humanity actually was, rather than what we had assumed them to be. He nodded slowly, though I could not tell whether it was agreement or simply exhaustion, and dismissed me to continue my work on the review. Over the following days, as the full data review continued, we began piecing together a clearer picture of what had actually happened during those 20 minutes, and every new piece of information made the picture more unsettling rather than less. We confirmed that the human vessel had left Council space entirely within hours of the engagement's end, moving in a direction that our tracking systems eventually lost somewhere near the edge of mapped territory. It had not returned. It had not sent any further communication. It had simply demonstrated what it was capable of, and then departed, as though the entire encounter had been nothing more than a brief, unwanted interruption to whatever business had originally brought it near our borders. I found this restraint more disturbing than any amount of aggression could have been. A species intent on conquest does not disable ships and then withdraw. A species intent on demonstrating power for its own sake does not decline to broadcast its victory to every neighboring system. What we had witnessed felt, the more I studied it, less like the opening move of an invasion, and more like a brief, almost weary correction, the kind of response you might give to a persistent but ultimately minor irritation, delivered with just enough force to make the point, and no more. I remember sitting with the diplomat who had asked so many pointed questions during the engagement itself, the pale-skinned representative whose frustration had matched my own uncertainty, and discussing what this might mean for the Council's future dealings with humanity. She asked me directly whether I thought humanity posed an existential threat to the Council. I told her, honestly, that I did not know, but that I no longer believed the question could be answered using the frameworks we had relied on before. What troubled me most, I told her, was not the possibility that humanity might choose to fight the Council directly. It was the growing suspicion that humanity had never needed to prove anything to us at all, that the entire engagement had cost them almost nothing, no visible damage, no reported losses, no meaningful expenditure of resources, while it had cost the Council 6 warships, dozens of injured personnel, and something far harder to measure or repair: the quiet, foundational confidence that had underpinned Council military doctrine for as long as anyone could remember. She asked what I thought that confidence should be replaced with. I told her that I did not have a complete answer yet, only a growing conviction that the old measurements, ships and weapons and territory, had never told the whole story about any species, and that humanity had simply been the first to show us, in the clearest and most costly way possible, exactly how incomplete our understanding had always been. That evening, alone in my quarters, I pulled up the original report I had submitted at the very start of that day, the one predicting total human defeat within 6 standard hours, and read it through slowly from beginning to end. I did not delete it. I did not revise it. I left it exactly as it was, a permanent record of exactly how wrong careful, well-trained analysis could be, when it was built on assumptions no one had ever thought to question. And I understood, sitting there in the quiet of my own quarters, that the fear I felt was not really about the human vessel at all. It was about every other report sitting in the Council archive, written by analysts just like me, about every other species we had confidently measured and confidently underestimated, and the growing, uncomfortable possibility that we had been making the same mistake for far longer than any of us had ever imagined. Word of the engagement reached the wider Council government within a week, and with it came a flood of demands for answers that no one on our station, myself included, felt fully prepared to give. I was summoned before a joint committee of military and diplomatic representatives, a formal hearing unlike anything I had experienced in my career, and asked to walk through the entire engagement from the moment the human vessel had first been detected to the moment it had disappeared from our tracking systems. I remember standing before that committee, a semicircle of representatives from a dozen member species, all of them watching me with expressions ranging from open skepticism to poorly concealed alarm, and understanding that I was no longer simply reporting on an incident. I was being asked, in effect, to explain how the foundations of Council military confidence had cracked in the span of 20 minutes, and I did not have a comfortable answer to give them. I presented the data as clearly as I could. 6 warships disabled, none destroyed. 0 confirmed human casualties, and as far as our sensors could determine, 0 confirmed damage to the human vessel itself. A single brief transmission, requesting withdrawal, delivered without threat or demand, followed by complete and immediate departure once the engagement concluded. I told the committee, as I had told the Admiral days before, that every element of this engagement suggested precision and restraint rather than aggression, and that this restraint troubled me more than outright hostility would have. A representative from one of the larger member species, a stern and heavily armored being whose name I have chosen not to remember, asked me directly, whether I believed the Council should now consider humanity a hostile power. I told him that hostile was the wrong word, that nothing in the human vessel's behavior suggested a desire for conflict, but that dismissing them as harmless would be an even greater error than the one that had led to 6 disabled ships and a damaged fleet's confidence. He asked what word I would use instead. I remember pausing for a long moment before answering, choosing my words as carefully as I had ever chosen anything in my professional life, and telling him that I believed the correct word was capable, and that capability, when paired with the kind of patience and restraint we had witnessed, deserved far more respect and far more careful study than the Council had ever given it before. The hearing continued for the better part of a full day, question after question circling the same unanswerable center: what humanity actually was, what they actually wanted, and whether the engagement represented an isolated incident or the first visible edge of something far larger that the Council had simply never bothered to notice before. I answered what I could honestly answer and admitted, more times than I think the committee found comfortable, that large parts of the picture remained genuinely unknown to us. Toward the end of the hearing, one of the quieter representatives, an elder diplomat from a species known for careful, deliberate speech, asked me a question that I have carried with me every day since. She asked whether I believed the Council had lost the engagement. I told her that in the narrowest military sense, we clearly had. 6 ships disabled against 0 visible losses on the human side was not a result anyone could reasonably call a victory. But I told her that I believed the true loss ran deeper than the tactical outcome, deeper than the damaged hulls currently being repaired in our docking rings. What the Council had actually lost, I told her, was the quiet, unspoken certainty that had shaped every strategic decision for generations. The assumption that Council forces, properly deployed, could overcome any threat a younger species might present. That certainty was gone now, and I did not believe it would ever fully return, not after 20 minutes had been enough to prove how fragile it had always been. She asked what I believed should replace it. I told her, as honestly as I could, that I did not know, only that whatever replaced it would need to be built on genuine curiosity, rather than assumed superiority. Because assumed superiority was precisely the flaw that had led us into that engagement so unprepared in the first place. The hearing concluded without any clear resolution, as I suspect such hearings often do, but in the weeks that followed, I noticed real changes beginning to take shape across the station, and, from what I could gather through official channels, across the wider Council government as well. New protocols were drafted for encountering unfamiliar vessels, protocols that emphasized observation and communication over immediate military posturing. Threat assessment procedures, the very procedures I had used to write my original 6-hour prediction, were pulled apart and rebuilt from the ground up, with new weight given to behavioral analysis rather than simple counts of ships and weapons. I was reassigned, somewhat to my surprise, to lead a newly formed division tasked specifically with reassessing every prior threat report the Council had ever filed on humanity, and I remember the strange, quiet satisfaction of finally being given real authority over a subject I had, until recently, understood so poorly. It did not feel like a promotion in the way I had once imagined career advancement might feel. It felt more like being handed the pieces of something broken and asked to figure out how it had shattered, so that it might never shatter in quite the same way again. The human vessel itself was never located again, not in the weeks that followed, not in the months after that. It had appeared, delivered its brief and unmistakable lesson, and vanished back into whatever vast unknown region of space humanity called home, leaving the Council to sort through the wreckage of its own assumptions without any further contact to guide the process. I found myself thinking often, during those long weeks of review, about the calm, unhurried voice that had spoken through that single transmission, the request for withdrawal delivered without anger or threat, as though the entire engagement had been a minor inconvenience rather than a genuine test of strength. I thought about the restraint shown in disabling, rather than destroying, the precision that suggested a species entirely capable of far greater violence choosing, deliberately, not to use it. And I understood, more clearly with each passing week, that the nightmare the Council now quietly whispered about in strategy sessions and closed-door hearings was not born from anything humanity had actually done to us. It was born from the terrifying realization of how much more they had clearly chosen not to do. A full cycle passed before I felt I finally understood enough to write a report I could stand behind completely, And even then, I knew it would only be a beginning rather than a conclusion. I titled it, after much deliberation, A Reassessment of Foundational Threat Doctrine, and I submitted it to the Joint Committee, with none of the careless confidence that had marked my very first report on the human vessel so many months before. In that report, I tried to explain what I had come to believe about the entire encounter, and about everything it had revealed regarding the Council's long-standing approach to measuring danger. I wrote that for generations, the Council had built its sense of security on visible, countable things, the size of a fleet, the number of warheads, the reach of a supply chain, and that these measurements, while not entirely useless, had never told the complete story about any civilization we encountered. I wrote that humanity had exposed this flaw not through malice, but simply by existing as something our old equations had never been built to account for. I included in that report the testimony of officers who had served aboard the 6 disabled ships, soldiers who described, almost uniformly, a strange calm settling over their vessels in the final moments before their systems went dark, as though whatever force had disabled them had done so with a precision that left no room for panic, no lingering damage, nothing beyond the simple, undeniable message that resistance had already become pointless. I wrote that this calm, more than any weapon, was the true measure of what we had encountered, a level of control so complete that violence itself had become almost unnecessary. I remember presenting a summary of this report before a smaller, quieter gathering than the original hearing, mostly senior analysts and a handful of military officers who had requested to hear my findings directly, rather than read them secondhand. The admiral from the original engagement was there, seated near the back, older-looking somehow than he had appeared those months before, though I suspect it was simply the weight of everything that had happened settling visibly into him. I told that room, as plainly as I could, that I no longer believed the Council's old threat models could reliably predict the outcome of any encounter with a species we did not fully understand, and that humanity had simply been the clearest, most costly demonstration of a flaw that had likely existed in our thinking for far longer than any of us wanted to admit. I told them that rebuilding those models would take years, perhaps longer, and that the process would require a kind of humility the Council had rarely needed to practice before, an honest willingness to admit how little we actually knew about the civilizations sharing the galaxy alongside us. Someone in the room asked, near the end of my presentation, whether I believed humanity would return to Council space again. I told them I did not know, and that this uncertainty itself was perhaps the most important lesson of the entire encounter. We had spent generations assuming we could predict the behavior of any species smaller and younger than ourselves, and that assumption had cost us 6 warships, and a great deal more that could not be measured so easily. I told them that the only honest answer I could give was that we needed to be prepared for humanity to return, and equally prepared for the possibility that they might never feel the need to. In the months that followed, I noticed a quiet shift in how humanity was discussed across the station, and eventually across the wider Council government, as reports of the engagement spread through official and unofficial channels alike. The old dismissive language, the casual references to humans as young, reckless, and manageable, faded from official documents, replaced by a more careful, more measured tone that acknowledged how little we truly understood about what humanity was capable of. New protocols emphasized caution and observation over the confident, dismissive posturing that had characterized our approach for as long as I had worked within Council analysis. I found myself, more than once, thinking back to that first afternoon, sitting in the mostly empty canteen with an unfinished meal in front of me, confidently typing out a 6-hour prediction that I had genuinely believed to be generous. I did not feel ashamed of that younger version of myself, not exactly, because I understood now that he had simply been working with the tools the Council had given him, tools built on generations of assumptions that had never once been seriously tested against something like humanity. What I felt instead, when I thought back on that day, was a quiet, persistent unease that I suspect never fully leaves anyone who has watched their entire framework for understanding the universe come apart in the space of 20 short minutes. I had entered that war room believing I understood the shape of danger in the galaxy, confident that I could measure it accurately from behind a console, using numbers and models that had served the Council well for longer than my own lifetime. I left that war room, and every room that followed it in the long months of review and reassessment, understanding something far more unsettling. Somewhere out among the stars, humanity continued its own quiet business, unconcerned, as far as any of us could tell, with whatever conclusions the Council drew from a brief and largely bloodless encounter near the threshold colonies. They had not returned to gloat. They had not sent further warnings. They had simply demonstrated, with a calm and almost gentle precision, exactly how mistaken we had been about them, and then continued on their way, as though the entire matter had already been settled in their own minds, long before we had even finished asking the question. I still keep a copy of my original report, the one predicting total human defeat within 6 standard hours, filed alongside the final version of my reassessment, the 2 documents sitting side by side in my personal archive, as a permanent reminder of how completely confidence can mislead even careful, well-trained analysis. I read them both from time to time, not out of guilt, but because I believe the distance between them, the space separating 6 confident hours from 20 humbling minutes, contains the most important lesson the Council has ever been forced to learn. We had spent generations searching the galaxy for the next great threat, watching for fleets larger than our own, weapons more advanced than our own, empires more ambitious than our own. We had never once considered that the greatest correction to our confidence might come from a single quiet ship, crewed by a species we had never bothered to take seriously, arriving without warning, delivering its lesson without cruelty, and departing again, long before we had even finished calculating how badly we had misunderstood them. That, I have come to believe, is the true shape of the nightmare that now quietly haunts every strategy session and closed-door hearing across Council space. Not the fear of humanity's weapons, whatever they may truly be. Not the fear of their fleets, however small they may still appear on paper. It is the fear of every other assumption we have never thought to question, sitting quietly in our archives, waiting for its own 20 minutes to arrive.